Good morning, everyone. Many of you have signed up for this webinar, and we're very pleased that our subject has aroused such interest. For this roundtable, I'm very pleased to welcome three experts who are going to talk to us about their study and research into civic space, democracy and associations. So we have Alexandrina Najmowicz, who is Secretary General of the European Civic Forum, Julien Talpin, who is a political science researcher, research director at CNRS, coordinator at the Observatoire des Libertés Associatives, and Siri Hummel, who is the director of the Maecenata Institute. Before I give you the floor, I'd like to firstly introduce the IFMA, that's the French Institute for Civil Society Organizations, in a few words, and tell you about our program for generating knowledge on associations at European level. We have launched this association 3 years ago in order to contribute to democracy. Since we were created, we called upon the French association sector via a wide-reaching consultation what their needs were, and Europe came out as a European subject. And so we decided to set up a working group with around 50 actors and researchers from 16 different countries, which we co-led with the Maecenata Institute. And thanks to Siri for having worked on this with us, and also with the Institute for Social Research and the associative movement. Our working group brought forth 2 deliverables that you can find on our website. A white paper on issues surrounding knowledge, which sets out potentials for priority research for the future, and a collaborative online library in English, which is the beginning of gathering the existing work together. This work identified 4 main areas of knowledge, 4 main priorities for the future for research, which I wanted to remind you of in this introduction, or introduce it if you aren't already familiar with it. Firstly, it's to do with describing the history of associations and their action in Europe, to recount how the world of associations has been shaped by historic influences and events, but also to talk about how associations have shaped history themselves. What have their main contributions to society been in response to social needs, and how they have inspired new ambitious public policy, how they have contributed to shaping democracy, civic space, and perhaps even European citizenship. The second need is to have an up-to-date overview of the political, legal, and statistic aspects to do with associations in Europe, because since the end of the John Hopkins Comparative Nonprofit Sector Project in 2005, we have been lacking data at European level to document the reality of associations throughout Europe. And when we don't know what our weighting is, we don't have the same capacity to call upon society and the public policymakers. And then there's a legal aspect, because legislation shapes the associated world in each country, and we are stronger if we can better compare the different legislative environments and what legislative environments favour associations or are an obstacle to them. And then the political aspect, because we haven't yet organised ourselves to be able to compare the different association-linked policies in Europe and understand which are favourable or unfavourable. And the third need is to analyse the contribution of associations to democracy, to trust, and the vitality of civic space. Firstly, acting as an intermediary, this is what associations do, and this requires further study to understand how associations contribute to daily democracy. Then the workings of advocacy from the world of associations is very little documented in terms of what it covers and how it advances society. And then we need to know what social innovation comes out of associations to understand the mechanisms by which associations identify social projects and enable them to be addressed. And then at a time when democracy is going through a crisis, it would be useful to understand the capacities that the associative sector has to act as a buffer to anti-democratic movements. How can associations particularly contribute at individual level to produce or restore institutional and citizen trust? Despite this contribution by associations to European democracy, there is unfortunately no category which specifically covers general interest associations in primary law at EU level, and the European Commission has a broad interpretation of civil society, including professional council or professional consulting bodies, internal lobbyists, independent consultants, lawyers, offices, unions, professional associations, etc. So producing additional knowledge would allow the role of general interest associations to be recognised in European law, whether it's within law on associations or law on public procurement and state subsidies. And then the final need is to study the development of public policy, and the impact of this on associations. Currently, the effects of national and European policy on the associative sector still needs to be studied further. Mapping policies for support to associations in Europe would allow us to define favourable or unfavourable or even freedom-destroying practices on the part of the institutions, and there also needs to be a full list made of European law mechanisms which are favourable to associations and which have not yet been transposed into national law. A study of financing methods and how these are developed also seems necessary. What are the specific effects of the increase in public procurement, for example, and also what are the legislative restrictions which have to do with bolstering the needs for responsibility and transparency? Do these changes hinder the action of associations? The associations are also subject to a growing influence from the market via social entrepreneurship models. They have to produce impact via a social investment method, and there is a growing influence of management and commercial-based approaches in their ways of governance, their funding and their evaluation. So what impact does this have on the socio-political functioning and on associative projects? How is this trend encouraged by public policy and also by private funding? Finally, the European context is currently favourable to reflection on the legal framework of civil society organisations. Following the adoption of the Lagodinsky report by the European Parliament, discussions on the status of associations are currently underway and have brought forth a strategy concerning this. Bearing in mind the prescriptive nature of this work, the associative sector must be involved to come up with its own model and to be able to contribute to knowledge work, transnational knowledge work, to better define what associations are doing and how they contribute to society and democracy. Via these different needs for knowledge, which I've just presented, we can see that research and studies have a lot to contribute to better acknowledge the democratic role of associations and therefore better protect their freedoms and better support them. Our work has also enabled us to shed light on the fact that currently there is no European network for associative knowledge, and that the links between associations and universities at European level need to be structured. What is worse, analysis of a bibliography of 650 references on associations in Europe carried out as part of our work has shown that European countries were minority contributors when actually these are the first actors concerned. There were 250 references which were American and 50 references which were Chinese. These conclusions mean that the institution needs to carry on its action in order to set up an international community of alliances and bring actors together around a future programme for knowledge on associations and democracy in Europe. And this is what this series of webinars that we want to launch aims to do. So that's what I wanted to say to set the scene. We're now going to hear from our three speakers. And firstly, I just wanted to let you know that we have 3 questions that we're going to ask our speakers. After the 2 initial questions. The third will be more of a conclusion. We'll have a space for questions and answers with our participants. And what we suggest is that as we go through the different questions, you can ask your questions in the chat, and then we will come back to these later. So now I will give the floor to our 3 speakers with the first question. Siri, Julien, Alexandrina, all 3 of you are actively involved in research or studies into civil society in Europe. Can you explain your work and your approach? And let's start with Siri.
Hi, Florian. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation and the introduction. And bonjour and hello from Berlin. Since we want to talk about democracy and the civic space today, I will talk about our project that we did about the Observatoire of the civic space, or the European civic space. We at the Maecenata Institute, we started the project on the European civic space Observatoire like 5 or 6 years ago, and it was based on the observation that we could see in more and more European countries that we heard from incidents, or we could hear acclamation of a growing, shrinking civic space. While we had this, it was all already known from Hungary, for example, or Poland under the peace government these days, that they were like kind of the common examples of shrinking civic spaces, or the introduction of anti-NGO laws. And we could see that there was also ongoing debates in very different other countries like Spain, France, UK, but also in Germany. And we saw that we had to do with very different measures or very different incidents. And it started from banning of protests, which we could see in Spain or France, for example, but also more and more constraints, or like kind of over bureaucracy that came into life under the label of, for example, anti-money laundering policies or anti-terror laws. And what we could also see was that there were like kind of specific areas or specific sectors that were targeted, such as refugee aid, for example, humanitarian action, but also when it comes to LGBTQ plus organizations or gender equality, we could see that there was like a growing targeting of those organizations, often fueled by far rights, populist activists, and their political parties. So we could see like the development of defamation campaigning and even criminalization, that this became like kind of a strategy against civil society. And this was not just bound to political strategies or political sphere, but we could also see like a huge increase when it comes to the digital sphere. We could see an increase in the hate speech, for example. So we wanted to find kind of an answer to that. And then in Germany, we have this like a little bit like a special situation when it comes to our law on charity status, which is very, very important for the whole nonprofit sector here, that we have this high uncertainty when it comes to the political activism, or what is allowed in political activism under the charitable status. Because by law or by our constitution, it is mainly seen as part or as work in the parties, but not in civil society. And this makes it possible to use the withdrawal of the charitable status as kind of political weapon or political instrument against those organizations that are too critical or too left or too whatever. So what we did was first we connected with different experts from different European countries, and we started to talk to them and to ask them, what do you see from your perspective? What are the main problems in the country, in your country, when it comes to the shrinking civic space? And on the same time, we started to try to cluster similarities in the measures, because there were so different ones. And so the approach was kind of twofolded. From the very beginning, we had this idea of collaborative research, connecting with experts across Europe to identify and analyze the specific challenges that faced by their organization in their respective countries, but also always trying to recognize patterns so we could like kind of categorize recurring issues, which we found during the project, for example, the fact or the phenomenon of secularization under anti-terror policies, for example, the influence of the far-right movements, but also the increasing bureaucracy or bureaucratic burdens on many organizations. And finally, we also were always interested, or we always wanted to explore the potential of countermeasures so that we could kind of enable civil society or help them to adopt and to mitigate these challenges and try to keep up a safe space or creating safeguard in the space for civil society action and democracy.
Thank you very much, Siri, for that overview of the work of the Maecenata Institute. Julien, I'd like to ask you the same question. Can you give us an overview of what the Observatoire for Civic Freedoms does? Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to address this issue because I think we need to. There's a lot of work that's been done and all of the people here are contributing very much to this. But I think it's very useful to share the comparative work and the knowledge that we have on civic freedom and associations in Europe. So here I've got my hat on as the coordinator of the Observatory of Civic Freedoms. That's the role I'm playing today. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we do. So the Observatory came out of a growing concern surrounding the attacks on civic freedom in France, particularly since 2015. There was a particularly important turning point in France at that time with the state of emergency, which followed on from the attacks. And so it was the legislative state of emergency, but it also had to do with the relations between associations and public powers. And this went on and on in France. And we were confronted with difficulties in the associative sector. Associations and NGOs called upon us as social science researchers to try and document these issues to strengthen their advocacy. One of the bases of our work is the link between associative activists and certain groups and the Minister Gabriel Attal at the time he was the Minister on Associations, and these met to raise the alarm on the attacks that were being carried out on civic space, the repression that's going on, or rather the NGOs and these groups joined together to express this, and the minister actually said, I don't see what the problem is. And so the response to this was setting up this observatory for civic freedoms to try and respond to this and to show that there was a problem with civic freedoms in France, and that it wasn't just the case in Hungary, Poland, etc., but that Western Europe is also concerned by this issue. And so we started this research work with a group of academics that came together in order to create bridges and to create links with particularly what the IFMA does on this issue. The associative sector, links with the academic sector weren't that strong at the time. Each one was working in their own little silo. And so we needed to try and build these bridges and to carry out research at the observatory to respond to the need for knowledge in the associative sector. The first point of this was to try to categorize what we understand by civic freedoms in the French, from the French point of view. So we published a first report on civic freedoms in France, and the aim was to document the phenomenon in the broadest way possible in a cross-sector way, bringing together environmental agencies, rights associations, everybody concerned, all actors, taking a really cross-cutting view at all levels too, involving problems with the central state and also the local authorities. And we tried to document this phenomenon and also conceptualize it in the broadest way possible. There was a lot of talk about repression of social movements. There was the Yellow Vests movement at the time too, which was at the top of the political and media agenda at the time. There was a lot of police violence, and that became a real public issue at the time, and quite rightly so. So what we wanted to do was to really delve into what was going on in France, and we needed to understand it from the perspective of from the truncheon to the removal of subsidies, etc. So there were all sorts of, this repression was taking all sorts of forms, from removal of subsidies, cutting off of subsidies, and more physical forms, etc. So it was taking all these different forms, and that is what started us off working on this. We wanted to work on sectoral issues. We published reports. There were studies done into certain sectors, and we have just published a report on the associative sector, which supports exiled people. There are a lot of these structures in France currently, and we published a particular report into landlords and social housing in France on Muslim associations, which were very much concerned by the repression of civic space. And to go a bit further, in terms of the way we work, to date, we've worked in a qualitative manner by carrying out the most rigorous work possible, setting objectives, looking into the conflict between associations and the public authorities. And our observation from that, after our 5 years of existence, is that this work is useful, it's necessary. It remains to be seen what effects that can produce for civil society, but also in the relations that we have with the public authorities and the media spotlight that's shone on our work, the answer we often get is, well, that's all very well, but the phenomena that you're documented are marginal. It only concerns a few cases. There are around 1.5 million associations in France nowadays, and there are only a very few problematic cases where we can see this conflict between civil society organisations and the public powers. And so we would need to have a more quantitative survey to take account of all of this in a more systematic manner to see the conflicts between the public authorities and associations in France. So that's what's at stake, to try and link the associative difficulties in France to the scale of the problem. We don't have full results yet. We've just finished this study, but my current reflection is that to feed into advocacy, to strengthen advocacy, we need to speak the language of power, and the language of power is figures. So that's the direction we're taking. We need to have documents with figures to be as precise as possible. And I think we also need, at European level, to carry out a comparative analysis of these phenomena to try and delve into this further. And I hope we will be able to move in this direction over the next months and years. Thank you very much, Julien. And finally, for the presentation of the work of the European Civic Forum and the monitoring study, Alexandrina, perhaps you could now present your work. Thank you.
A lot of what I wanted to say has been already said, and I will try to present it differently to avoid repetitions, because, well, in the end, it's a good thing that many organizations work on the same issues at our different levels. So just to say, the European Civic Forum is a network of about 100 associations across Europe, precisely across 30 countries in Europe, not limited to the EU as such. We have membership also in the Western Balkans. We've been working for 20 years now. Next year we will celebrate our 20 years, basically to promote an enabling space for civil society to act and operate, what now we call enabling environment for civil society, to engage in community work, but also in public sphere. To support also the structuring and the alliance across the sectors and across the borders between civil society organizations, so at the European level. And we've been among the initiators of a cross-sectoral representation body of civil society at the European level called Civil Society Europe, which is somehow the kind of organization that the French Mouvement Associatif represents in France. Obviously, in historic and organizational terms, probably we are not yet there, but that was the idea. And finally, we work a lot, mainly through advocacy and campaigning, to have the European institutions recognize the role that civil society should play in societies and communities, but also in democracy. So to put in place mechanisms of dialogue between the institutions and civil society at European level mainly, but we do so also in support of our organizations nationally. And I don't think it's a coincidence that we all started actually to work on this notion of shrinking civic space around the same period in time. We started we launched our civic space observatory called Civic Space Watch in 2018. It was also a moment when the EU itself started to document these through the work of the executive agency, the European Union Agency on Fundamental Rights. Exactly in the same period. And if you remember, it was also the period in which, more precisely in 2017, the Hungarian parliament was adopting this NGO law, which was maybe not the first, I would say, because even before that we had already the Spanish gag law, but it was very much it gained very much public traction because it coincided also with this trend of dismantling a democratic state where civil society comes right after the judiciary and the media. And back then we were campaigning in 2017 in front of Hungarian embassies in a few European countries, trying to express our discontent, while we were aware very much back then that we didn't have so much power to counteract, if it's not to attract the attention of the media, institutions, and civil society itself. And that was constitutive of the creation of our Civic Space Watch. And it's not a research initiative. I want to specify, because we are mainly relying on evidence that we collect from the ground, from the activists themselves. Obviously, we are also doing desk research, and we are aggregating the data that we collect from activists and comparing it with other monitoring sources developed by Civicus or the European Union Agency. But in the first place, we really try to document what's going on the ground and give visibility to that. Actually, the observatory was even conceived, first of all, as a tool to build solidarity. And in the first years, it really took us a lot of efforts to connect civil society on the ground and to make these organizations aware that the various ways in which civic space is being restricted are not limited to Hungary, Poland, and a few illiberal states in the Eastern Europe, but they are really expressing under different circumstances in many, many European countries, including in the West. And now, after 6 years of monitoring, awareness raising, and a lot of advocacy work, I think we really reached this level of awareness both inside civil society and inside the institutions themselves, and it triggered some action at the European level. Based on the data that we collect, obviously, this informs all the rest of our activities, advocacy and capacity building, and we publish an annual report that informs the European Union and contributes to the European Union annual rule of law report that monitors the state of the rule of law and unfortunately for now only at the margins, what's going on inside of civil society space that is only part of a bigger chapter called checks and balances. Just to give you an example, last year our report documented through case studies severe restrictions in civic space in 15 European countries, and I will name the countries just to realize how big the phenomenon is. So in alphabetic order, let's take them: Austria, Bulgaria, Croatia, Czech Republic, Denmark, Estonia, France, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Latvia, Poland, Romania, Slovenia, and Spain. And we also documented some regional trends through the contribution of our partners from the Balkan Civil Society Development Network, as well as a specific cross-national trend, which last year was very visible, which was restriction of peaceful demonstrations in solidarity with Palestinian people. All these also helped us, actually, us civil society, meaning us, European Civic Forum, the membership, and those organizations with whom we cooperate, helped us understand and unpack what was behind this notion of shrinking civic space. And we came to develop a 6 dimension that for us are really constitutive of an enabling environment for civil society. And we analyze these restrictions against these 6 dimensions, which are the institutional, socioeconomic, and cultural environment in which civil society organizations develop and operate. Secondly, obviously, the state of respect and enact of civic freedoms in those countries, freedom of association, assembly, and expression. Thirdly, the extent to which the state itself is able to protect this space through its own policies or through prevention, investigation, or repression of any attacks on civic space. Fourthly, the financial viability and the funding policies that allow civil society to operate. And Julien mentioned that this is maybe not the most visible, but definitely one of the most important ways in which civil society landscape is being transformed over the last years, all across Europe. In the 5th place, we also look at the state of the dialogue between civil society and institutions across European countries, the extent to which, and when I say dialogue, I'm not referring to top-down consultations, but really spaces in which civil society can be agenda setter and can really influence public policies. And in the end, we also look at civil society's capacity itself to self-organize, to withstand the attacks, to its own development and capacity to resist and to build resilience in society. And we've been quite successful in this work, as I said, at least in raising awareness, because now I think analyzing and working on shrinking civic space is very much on the agenda of any European level network of civil society, because it really extends to so many sectors of activities, not only even to political actors that definitely are in the front line. We also realize that obviously there are some groups in the society, like the environmentalists, or some groups that provide solidarity with the migrants. In any case, this advocacy activity of the civil society is more in the front line of attacks, and is more and more denied by institutions. The right to protest itself is very much in danger in many, many European countries, and it translates in many forms: repression of demonstrations, heavy-handed policing, and many other ways. Criminalization of activists also unveil the very political nature of repression and prosecution, because more and more we see that those that are very vocally standing against policies that they deem uninclusive or damaging to the environment, their voice will be more and more curtailed through various public order measures or anti-terrorism, anti-money laundering, etc., etc. I will not get into the details of the trends, because I think I approach the end of my initial 5 minutes, just to say that thanks to this work, also the European Union itself became very much aware and trying to be active in support and to protect the space for civil society. We are living a paradox in which, on one side, we have some tools at the European level, as the annual Rule of Law report, and also we see that politically civil society space and the civil society role in society is very much recognized in the narratives, in the institutional narratives. But as a paradox, we also see that through funding policies and various other measures and policies that the EU takes, civil society risks being affected directly or indirectly. And that's really a problem and the paradox of working at the European level on one side, trying to trigger European action to preserve the space for civil society and action on democracy and the rule of law, but in the same time to be aware that some of the European policies in the economic area are shrinking the rights of those that civil society is trying to defend at the national level. So I think in the coming years, we will really need to be aware of this paradox and to discuss together and to strategize at the level of civil society to see how we address it.
Thank you very much, Alexandrina. I haven't seen any questions or comments in the chat, but I would encourage you to write in the chat, or you can write in the question and answer section, which is at the bottom of the Zoom window. So perhaps to launch the debate, Julien, Siri and Alexandrina, do you have any questions yourselves? Would you like to ask any questions of your colleagues? Yes, Siri.
Thank you. I would be interested in asking Alexandrina, what's your experience, or what do you think about it? I totally agree with you that I think the awareness raising was quite successful on the European level when it comes to the shrinking civic space. But beyond that, what do you think are successful instruments on the European level to actually protect the civic space? Because our perspective is mainly on the national level, and we could see, like you said, it's in every debate, it is highlighted how important civil society is and how important it is to safeguard the space, etc., etc. But when it comes to actually the policies on national level, to be honest, it didn't follow much when it comes to actually securing funding, for example, or protecting against right-wing activists, for example. So I'm interested. What do you think on the EU level are the sharpest spots to say like that?
Florian, should I respond immediately?
Oui, Alexandrina.
Yes,
go
so
ahead.
thank you for the question. It's really one of the core questions. I think there are many ways in which acting at the European level can be very useful. Before I get to the institutions and what can we trigger as preventive or action, just to say that I think it's super important to connect civil society and to build this transnational solidarity. I think this is really the starting point, because movements and civil society sometimes are so overwhelmed in their own context, trying to withstand all these challenges, that solidarity and confirmation that outside their own context that there are people that support them is sometimes very useful to maintain mobilization, and sometimes can also be useful to put pressure on the governments. Obviously, it didn't work with the Hungarian and the Polish government, but it did work, for example, when we tried to organize solidarity actions with the Danish government, because we managed to build some international pressure to put on the government and on the parliament, and to halt some legislation that potentially could have criminalized solidarity with migrants. So I really think international solidarity and pressure can work. It's not the only answer, obviously. Then simply the awareness and the possibility for actors to learn from experience in order not to reproduce the same errors, or to learn from failure. I think learning from failure is super important among the civil society movement. Sharing knowledge and simply solidarity. And thirdly, to really come to the European institutions level, despite the fact that there's awareness and some kind of political willingness to act, then we come back to the EU competence, and very often there's need to, in order for the EU to launch an infringement procedure, there's need for the legislation to be enacted, and often it comes too late. That was the case for Hungary. Regarding the case for France, for example, we alerted really at the early stage when specific legislation has been adopted in France. I'm referring to the Contrat d'engagement républicain. We alerted the European institutions on the potential damage that this legislation can create. Then we the French organizations documented the impact and the first implementation consequences of this act, and still the European Commission is not able to trigger very specific action through its own means. So the problem is that we are very much focusing in Europe on reactive measures, and even we don't have that much leverage. If we think about the potential use, for example, of the rule of law weapon, which is the Article 7 in the treaty, which is to withdraw voting rights in the Council for a country that would not respect the rule of law. Well, this hasn't been done even for Hungary and Poland. So it's very complicated. The reason why we are currently working with other civil society members, but also like-minded organizations like the European Center for Not-for-Profit Law, to trigger some kind of early warning mechanism beyond this annual cycle, which is very lengthy and which prevents the European institutions to react on real time when an attack is being documented. So we are really trying, let's see that we look at the next 5 years to trigger some early warning and reaction from the institutions when we alert them on attacks to civic space, and to create some kind of European coordinated alliance or hub for protection of civil society. Obviously not inventing or reinventing what already exists on the ground in terms of protection bodies, but rather connecting them and trying to have a European coordination. That would be our priority for the next years. And yeah, we do have some priorities that are set by the Commission itself for the next mandate to work on protection of civil society.
Thank you, Alexandrina. We have a comment in the chat talking about the opinion from the Economic, Social and Environmental Council in France on the weakening of funding for associations, and that there will be an event organised on Wednesday, the 11th December, to think about how the recommendation can be implemented based on the SESE report. The title is The Democratic Emergency. It has to do with the development of the relation between public funding and the shrinking of civic space, with taking in stock of the development and the restrictions on civic space. Do you have any particular questions for Siri or Alexandrina? Julien? Well, one of my convictions is, working on the French side of things, is to provide the mechanisms for response. And I can see in the comments in the chat, a lot of them have to do with a shared observation. The fact that it's important to document this phenomenon, and that's why research is important. But of course, it's not enough. And so other things need to be done too. And what I'm wondering is, of course, we need to work on all levers, but what is the most effective level at which we can address the current political situation? We can see that in France and in the EU, they're absolutely capable of stopping civic reflection in France. You can see that there is the Collective Against Islamophobia in France, other associations which they tried to prevent from working, but nothing happened. And when there are judgments, when there's the Commission for the Maintenance of Order, for example, in France, that had absolutely no impact. And the moral condemnation by the European institutions is not a very effective lever, I don't think. So what are the other levers that are at our fingertips? And that could take us back to Europe. One of these is the issue of rights, or rather law, which is a vital tool. If we've had a certain number of legal wins over the past few years, which we have, via mobilising law, and also on the issue of the CER, the Contract of Commitment to the Republic, there's been a lot of work done by groups and with the local authorities on this. And then at national level or European level, the Commission on Human Rights can help us with that. There are affairs that are underway, there are sentencings going on, trials going on. And so there's the issue of law, and then there's the issue of money too, which we might go into further later on. That's a question which is very clear in France, because there's the idea of creating an assistance fund for solidarity. So then there's the issue of the dissolution of certain actors in the associative world by the French government, and then the disappearance of funding, the fact that some associations are being forced, therefore, to just cease their activities. So there are other levers to be created from this point of view. And then there's the issue of this assistance fund, which could be financed by the associations themselves in France to help NGOs in difficulty. So there are all of these measures which are worth putting in place at European level, perhaps. And then a last point, it's a question, but also a comment. I'd like to hear your comments on this, in fact. I firmly believe in the role of local authorities. We're in a national political context in France, but I feel that this is true of a lot of other European countries today, where generally we can't win. Our ability to change law at French level is very restricted, and we have a government which is a right-wing government in power, and it's very probable that more of these will come into power over the next few years, and then the legislative framework may develop in a favourable way to the civic freedoms, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue our work to change laws and carry out advocacy. I think that it is possible, even in this context, to do things at local level, to work with the local authorities. There's also the national scale, but we are trying to set up a network of local authorities to support civic freedoms. And there's also the European networks. Okay, perhaps they could be mobilised more on this issue. Perhaps there's a lever there. I'm always a little bit sceptical about the role of advocacy in the world, even though I contribute to this. I feel that we are often all about advocacy, but there are things that we can do to advance civic freedoms by calling on governments that are aligned with our cause at European level or at local level, and there are networks to be created, including at European level, and that will help us make our combats more offensive rather than defensive, our struggles rather more offensive rather than defensive. So that's what's going on at French level today. Thank you, Julien. Siri, would you like to react to any of that? The right levers, the right levels to use to transform law and European law, philanthropy, the local authorities, and how these can organise as a network?
Yes, sure. I think I could join with June in the observation. I mean, the way from research to politics or to policies is quite a long one, and so we have like a kind of a similar situation in Germany. We see on the national level, you probably all have heard our government just exploded, and we had high hopes on two laws that were kind of one to foster democracy, to make democracy stronger, the other one to finally get more security in the non-profit law, but and both laws will not will come into parliament. So this is quite frustrating. But on the same time, I see, as Julien said, we have to look at the local level. I think the local level is like one of the most important level when it comes to civil society, because that's actually the level where things happen, where civil society happens. And I know like many cases on the local level where you could see that things were possible, or there were more freedom, or more capacity, or more resources to actually build or to protect things or projects that were in danger than on the national level. So, but the thing is, we have the tendency when we look on the local level that we kind of forget it's getting too specific, and we still have to be aware that we have to widen our perspective. Because we know there are so many similarities when it comes to the national and the European level, and so this is quite important. I don't know if this is an answer to the comment, but that was the ideas I had when I heard Julien talking.
Thank you, Siri. There's a contribution from Louise Marie Blanchard talking about the first public meeting on Wednesday the 11th, which is called the General Assembly of Democracy. I am not sure that the link has been posted in the chat, but we'll do that in a second. There's also a question from Audrey for Julien. Julien, could you tell us more about the European Emergency Fund, who leads this, who coordinates this initiative? Oh, and I can see that you've replied. Regarding that point, it's an initiative, yes, but these are questions that are being asked in France. How can we support associations that are having difficulties due to repression by the public authorities? And there are two main things. There's mobilization, which is important, mobilization of philanthropic funds, which is important to use. And one of the reflections is the incapacity of the associative world itself to set up a financial self-defense system. Rather, whether it could do this, or whether the associations that are doing better could help associations that aren't doing as well. For example, cooperatives, etc., those that have been started up at the start of the 21st century. It's something that's going on in France, but it would be worth expanding it at European level. We could have initiatives to do this. It has to do with these different levers. There's the role of philanthropy and self-organization on the part of the associative sector, which is also important in this area. Thank you, Julien. Alexandrina has a comment, and then we will move on to the second question.
Pour dire que, certes, peut-être le plaidoyer n'a pas donné des résultats très concrets, même si pour faire retirer des législations libertaires... Ah, sorry. I should not speak in French. Sorry. So I just wanted to respond to Julien that, yes, I do agree that sometimes it can be depressing to when we look at the very concrete outcomes of the advocacy that we do in terms of did we ever manage to withdraw a repressive legislation or to correct or to have the EU intervene in support of civil society on one situation or another. I don't think the answer is very easily to say no, because there's not only the European Commission. European Commission can clearly drag states in Court of Justice and do infringement procedures, but we used to have also the European Parliament, and there was some kind of pressure that you could build in the European Parliament that then could have an influence nationally through the political balance of power that the European Parliament represents. But I want to say here that unfortunately, after the last European elections, we are in a situation where we no longer can rely on the European Parliament. And paradoxically, you were mentioning, Julien, championing local authorities. For us as a European network, is really difficult to really relate directly to a local authority. That's the mandate of our national constituencies. At the European level, the European Committee of Regions, let's say, is not so much yet working on this issue. But I can clearly say that paradoxically, more and more we develop strategies to work with the Council of the European Union. So with the states that meet in the Council, and to try to find champion states that would try to create some kind of dynamic in support of civil society space. And it really happened, for example, with Council conclusions under the Danish EU presidency. So, and it can happen also to have some states championing the respect of freedom to associate in some kind of council decisions on EU legislation. So it is really a paradox, but I'm afraid that in the next 5 years, a reality we will have to face is also not necessarily to gain much, but to preserve what we have. Looking at what threats can come directly from the European Parliament itself, I must say, through the influence of not even the far right, but really the center, the so-called center right, which leans more and more towards the far right. And they are very, very suspicious about the role of the NGOs. So yeah, dark times are around the corner, but just to say that besides advocacy, I think capacity and autonomy of civil society is really key. And here the funding issue comes. And there was a question about the European, a potential European mechanism or emergency fund. In institutional terms, it does not exist, but we want to trigger this also through the protection mechanism, because the EU has protection mechanism for development countries that allow both legal protection, relocation of activists under attack, but also emergency funding that does not go through the very lengthy and bureaucratic usual circles of funding. We want to trigger this for inside the European Union. But any EU funding would be bureaucratic anyway. This is the lesson that we learned. We also do a lot of, yet again, advocacy towards the philanthropic sector. And more initiatives pop up, even though there's not so much money invested in it, to really make available some flexible funding for civil society. There has been this initiative by Civitates to allow organizations to self-organize in alliances, specifically dedicated to monitor and report and organize resistance against the repressive legislation. But I think much more than that is needed. And ultimately what we can do at our own level as a European network is to regrant to our members to offer this very flexible funding that now our operating grant that we receive from the EU allows us to really provide emergency funds when needed, if needed, to an organization that needs to organize ad hoc because some kind of legislation or attacks are being perpetrated. So I think that a lot will be related to our own capacities to organize ourselves and to build our autonomy.
Thank you very much, Alexandrina. I'd now like us to move on to the second question. which once again is for each speaker. One of you is a researcher, that's you, Julien. Siri, you're a researcher too, but you work in an institution that mobilizes research. And Alexandrina, you work for an association that produces studies for the sector. We've started to address this question, but I wanted to hear your perspective on what are the issues involved for you in producing knowledge and how we can use the knowledge produced to inform and strengthen civil society organisations in Europe. So we've started to answer this question already, but how can we go further? Julien, over to you. I don't know if we're the best place to talk about the use of research, because of course the associations I work with do find our work useful, but the issue is to publish this, to lend legitimacy to it, of course. And in the French context, a few years ago, we were talking about funds being cut off, disqualification, cyber attacks, targeting associations, but we thought, well, it doesn't really matter. Look, there's police violence, there are much more important things going on. And so we need to shine a light on these things that might seem not very important. And this needs us to look at democracy in another way and address the issue in a bit more of a serious manner. It's one of the struggles that we're waging in France. There is a growing awareness of what certain actors in the associative sector are experiencing, and also certain public actors which are posing a problem, because the situation is getting more and more difficult. There are laws which are targeting us, but this collective awareness is important for that. And secondly, there needs to be a work on documentation to produce knowledge, to shine light on mechanisms that are often not very much known. And I'd like you to ask you to look at Mediapart today, where there are studies being published, and we work a lot with journalists, in fact. In a certain way, we help them. We help them to get out of tricky situations. We lead them towards certain subjects of interest. And in the cultural struggle against the freedom of reflection and association, there needs to be a link between scientific actors and media actors, so that often the media actors are subject to more repression actually because they do this, but that's a lever that we can act on. That's something that's useful. And in spite of everything, I'd like to say what I said before. Producing knowledge is not enough on its own. It's a brick in the wall, as it were. It's part of it, but there are other things that need to be going on at the same time. I'm a researcher myself, and so that's the work that I do. But to be quite honest, it's because I think there are other struggles that need to be carried out on financial issues, on legal issues, on transformation of public action and public policy at local level too. So I think it's good that researchers do research and that associations carry out activism. And there's this division of labour, which means that associations don't become overwhelmed if they have to carry out all the documentation work too. Well, they can't do everything all at the same time. So I think it's quite simple that the association should entrust us with this mission so that they can get on with their action and create partnerships between associations and the academic world is something that requires strategic reflection on the division of labour, which can help push forward our agenda, which is simply democracy. Thank you very much, Julien. That was very clear. Siri.
So, as you said, we are a researcher too. The Maecenata Institute is a research institute, but it's not a university. And so we always have this clear action core, or this clear perspective that we want to also empower, go out, doing the research actually for practitioners. And so our research always try to aims to serve like both as a kind of a diagnostic tool, if you want to say it like that, and as a research for action, so that we could see, or that we can enabling the organizations that we're working with to like kind of navigate what we can see is the increasingly challenging landscape we have right now. So this, of course, starts with mapping these challenges and the trends. So what we have to do and what we do is collecting data, documentation, analyze the systemic pressures facing CSOs across the continent. And by identifying these recurring patterns, we can provide a clearer picture what actually are the threats. And these again allows organization to see when it comes to their local challenges what is part of a broader even transnational trend, and what is not, and what can be done against it when it comes, for example, to the phenomenon of secularization that came with anti-terror policies, for example, or when we're talking about bureaucratic constraints or the defamation strategies. And the next step is clearly to exchange knowledge. And so what we did is we organized several events and meetings to connect experts, but also every time practitioners and activists across the different countries. So trying to foster pan-European exchange of the strategies and the experience, because this is collaborative, and this helps the organization learn from the best practice, but also from the failure. So they have like better resources or better knowledge about how to react to legal challenges, for example, when it comes to restrictive laws, or when it comes to public campaigning, so that they can better counter far-right narratives. So we always in the project thought about counter strategies too. So we started a platform and a website. You can see, you can go to shrinkingspace.eu, and this platform that connects civil society organizations and activists that are impacted by, for example, hate speech or bullying, or they have this problem with legal uncertainty in their work, with actually support services. So basically it brings together organizations that can help, for example, with legal aid. I don't know if you know hate aid, for example, that's a very good example, or with campaigning, with those organizations that are actually seeking help. And above that, we really try to collect everything, all the information we have within our own data, but also with collected data, and bring it out into the public to raise more awareness about the ongoing shrinking spaces. So finally, our research always aims into kind of a broader advocacy effort, because we try to highlight like the critical role that civil society plays in democracy. It's not possible without it. So talking to politics, to put it in the public, this is one of our very important work as well. So we know that this helps like mobilize the public support that puts pressure on decision makers to actually try to save or safeguard the civic space. So yeah, it's always this combination of research, but also think a little bit broader, think a little bit beyond what can we do with it, and how can we go further with it.
Thank you very much, Siri. Alexandrina, would you like to respond to finish this the second round of questions on how knowledge can be produced and then used to strengthen civil society organizations in Europe.
And we are not doing research, but the data that we collect, I think we are trying to make good use of it, both to build the capacity and the understanding inside the civil society sector, which is really key. And here I think it's very important, and this work, not only our work, but the work of any organization that documents and is a membership-based organization with connections and constituencies, that try to work across sectors and areas, is to show the intersection between attacks on climate activism, how it intersects with attacks, for example, on solidarity with Palestine, or criminalization of solidarity with migrants. And I think it's very important, because what we realized through our solidarity actions, for example, they were very demanding at a moment when in Poland there was action organized by the Polish women's strike, not necessarily only to defend women's reproductive rights, but interestingly, the women's reproductive rights was really at the basis of very general mobilization of society for democracy. And this is very important, and I think this is the strength that we can achieve inside civil society horizontally by mobilizing the knowledge and the information that we collect through our simply putting ourselves in networks and alliances. And ultimately, this idea that an attack on one category of rights is an attack in their universality, I think it also helps organizations to get out of their silos and to be more and more open to react and to build advocacy and alliances on topics that go beyond their mandate. And it's happening more and more still. These convergence spaces are weak at the European level because they are weakened both by the capacity of the organizations to dedicate time and resources, but also to what we can achieve in terms of I don't know, Julien, if your reactions and body language is related to what I say, but okay, it's a bit disturbing. You would say you are in contradiction. But I think, yeah, it's very important to maintain this mobilization inside civil society, while it's very complicated and difficult to realize the impact that we can create through mobilizations. But in the same time, we cannot simply allow ourselves and people and constituencies to just demobilize, because we will be facing times when this mobilization is really key, and civil society will be the last resort to try to defend democracy and humanity, after all. So I think it is really key not only to look for immediate outcomes in terms of achievements, but to really be able to maintain a long-term mobilization of civil society for rights and universality and democracy and inclusivity, and to have, yeah, these struggles united.
Thank you, Alexandrina. I haven't seen any new questions come up in the chat. So to sort of cross-reference what each of you have said, do you have anything to comment on anything that each of the other participants have said? I just wanted to say, sorry to Alexandrina, I just received a message that my father is in hospital, so actually my reactions had nothing to do with what you were saying. Just wanted to say that. In the difficult context that we're working in, one of the objectives that we can see that has emerged over the past few years is a growing solidarity in the association sector and civil society in France. And that wasn't the case right from the start. My external point of view on all that as a researcher is that I can see every day the difficulties with these sorts of solidarity, the financial issues between actors that are close to each other. And in spite of everything, the context is complicated. And so people are withdrawing a little bit. So to be quite clear, the biggest federation of of associations in France, which brings together 700,000 associations, has been working on these associative issues for years, and that wasn't the case from the start. So it represents major progress, and it represents something that we can use really to change how things are done, to change the balance of power. It's not just little associations that are carrying out a lot of activism. No, society at large is mobilizing. And so this is broadening, and it's very important. And there are further questions. How can we bring this to European level? How can we work in coalitions and alliances? So these are the different parts of the answer, which are actually key. Thank you, Julien. In this sort of front that's coming together, as you said, we could also mention that the French CESE, that's the Economic, Social and Environmental Council, voted unanimously on this. And they also voted to repeal the contract of commitment to the Republic, among other things. Siri, Alexandrina, before we move on to the conclusions, would you have any further comments? Would you like to say anything based on the comments that have come up? Siri, no. Alexandrina, no. We have 10 minutes remaining. So what I'd like to suggest is that we could now go to the conclusion, and you could tell, each of you could tell us, what do you think the future holds to strengthen the contribution of research to civil society? Siri, over to you.
I think I'll have to start with a rather gloomy perspective. I mean, if it comes to our project, because one of the biggest problem we're facing right now is funding. We started and Alexandrina already talked about the funding problem. Our shrinking space project, the funding of it ended like 2 years ago. And ever since we try to keep it up, keep it alive, but we can just do it on a very small scale, very small level, because there is no money. And we try to keep it alive with a smaller study that is based on climate protection, or the question if there is like a kind of a shrinking civic space in Germany for climate activism, because we did a research about the political framing or political narratives, but that's just a small part of it. So monitoring or the research, especially when you look on a longer timeline, needs consistency. So this is so clear, and but this is a totally challenge when you are funded by a project, or when it's based on project funding, because project funding always ends. And normally it ends after 1 year or 2 years. We were like kind of happy to have funding for 3 years. So this is I think one of the most pressing concerns or issues, that we have this problem with the inconsistency, because the funding is always project-based. And what we would need, especially on the European level, would be like consistent funding, so that we kind of could do actually reliable and impactful manners. And what I think is just really annoying, that you have this European funding, for example, SURF, that is actually there for protecting the civic space, but there are the funding is not really for research. It's not made because it's lump sum funding. I don't want to go into detail, but I think this is too unflexible, and this is really annoying, why we couldn't like combine the research about civil society with the direct empowerment of civil society. Yeah, so this is, in my opinion, one of the biggest thing we have to address is getting consistency funding for our civic space on the European level. And since I don't want to end like too gloomy, what I see is if I ask myself in a optimistic, or if I ask my optimistic voice more, then I think what is really cool is that it's easier than ever before in history to collect data, to share data. And so we could use like IE, for example, that one of the, you talked about our workshops, and one of the key knowledges we took from that is the problem within the European research community is still language barrier. And this shouldn't be a problem anymore, because thanks to IE, we really could easily translate articles. We could, or communication in general. So I have really hope in that. And I think it opens like a tremendous opportunities to cross-border collaboration, cross-border research, and data collection. So we can go beyond and really have like a knowledge exchange that we haven't had before. And so we can really go on in the development of better or unified strategies, as you said, to mobilize better, to protect and to expand the civic space. So yeah, that's my conclusion.
Thank you very much, Siri. Alexandrina, over to you for the conclusion.
I also saw in the chat a question brought by Jean-Baptiste regarding the participation of associations to the general interest, and I will link my my conclusions also to this, because I think, well, on one side, I would look at, you use, Jean-Baptiste, the word associations. At European level, we use the word civil society or civil society organizations. I think we have a very basic need at the European level in terms of research to work on a working definition of what we understand by civil society. And not only what we understand by civil society, I mean in the literature, because if you do a minimum of research, you would see that the word association appears in the legal systems of most of the European countries, though there are also other forms of organizations of not-for-profits, and European-wise in EU legislation and the practice of the, for example, European Economic and Social Committee, the term civil society includes both associations, NGOs, but also trade unions and employer organizations. So this is not necessarily problematic, because when we think about civil society's role to produce or to contribute to the general interest of the common good, then there's need for all these forces in the society to work together, and their work is relevant. When we think in terms of building how to say, a power game and having civil society participating in policy making nationally or at the European level, the notions of civil and social dialogue often come into conflict, maybe more at the European level than nationally. But I can say that unfortunately we are struggling so much at the European level to make space for civil dialogue, and while doing so, trade unions feel that this will endanger their own space, because they are in a situation where they still fight for their own space. So it's really a situation that we need to clarify. And an additional aspect of this need to work on a definition of what civil society is and what is the role is to have a recognition of this very political role of civil society to contribute to the common good, that expresses itself in two ways, not only in advocacy. Maybe the most obvious way to look at the political role of civil society, to think, oh, advocacy, NGOs, watchdogs that are doing advocacy for rights and democracy and so on. Yes, that's maybe the most visible, but I think that, for example, social and service providers are really the second main pillar of this political role, because they don't only provide services for people, but by doing so, they really envision a vision for the society that is inclusive and that gets out of the market logic. And this very role is in danger nowadays through the shifting of funding policies nationally, but also through European legislation and its direct consequences on associative models themselves. This is a very long conversation that we will not have time today, but I think it's really need to do a kind of comparative research of what, for example, are the consequences of the European competition policy, competition and state aid policy in shifting the landscape for funding civil society across European countries. So yeah, if I may bring a last point is to work and to reflect and to research on the impact of civil society. Here we are very weak at the level of the civil society at describing the impact that we create, and all the granting models are based on a business model that asks civil society to demonstrate in very quantitative indicators the impact that we can have through our project and grants on the society. This is very problematic on one side because it's very complicated to measure the impact in short term, which is the short cycle of a project, and often coming back to the I'm too long. Okay. Yes.
No, thank you. It's very interesting. Unfortunately, we're coming to the end of our discussion here. So by way of conclusion, I would like to indicate 3 aspects which seem to have emerged from what we just heard. One, that it's important to continue to disseminate knowledge and raise awareness to further recognition of associations, their democratic contribution and the need to protect them, and that it's important to mobilize the associative world itself in production and taking on board knowledge. This is a tool which is still not sufficiently taken on board for advocacy and for dialogue with public powers. And also, as Julien said, there needs to be this division of labour between academics and associations, each one with their own work, but working together. And then there's also the fact that we need to continue mobilizing research, and that associations linked with democracy must be, the idea of this must be disseminated in academic agendas across Europe. And we need to raise awareness, we need to bring actors and researchers together and produce new knowledge with states that need to be aware of these issues and linked with them. And there needs to be a European space for practices and learning with continual funding from public sources or private sources to support this. So raising awareness, bringing together actors, researchers, and producing new knowledge are the objectives of the European Knowledge Programme, which the Institute wants to develop in the future. So at the start of 2025, we'd like to see you back here for our next webinar. The date is not yet confirmed. It will be on private donations and associations at European level and the links between these with regard to democratic issues, and always from an angle of mobilisation and knowledge and research. You can keep up to date on what we're doing on our social networks on our website. We're currently finalising the English translation, and in this way you will find out about the date of the next webinar when it is determined. I would now just like to thank warmly our 3 speakers, Siri, Alexandra, Julien, and also everyone who's been involved in organising the webinar. And I'd also like to thank Amira and Veronique for the organisation. And I would like to thank our interpreters, Emma and Benoit, for the interpretation. I would like to thank all of you for your participation, and we'll see you back next year.